Hello everyone, and welcome back. Litany of Whispers brings you another story that will have your eyes glued to the screen. Before we begin this incredible tale, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your country, and the time you're watching. Stories like this travel across the world, and it's always amazing to see how many places people are listening from. If you enjoy powerful and little-known stories from history, please remember to subscribe and like the video if you haven't done so yet. Tonight's story takes us deep into the rugged hills and hollers of eastern Kentucky, to a quiet town called Paintsville, where one decision shocked an entire community. It begins with a young woman whose life already seemed unusual to everyone around her. People whispered about her wherever she went. Her name was Mabel, but most folks knew her by a name that sounded both strange and mysterious. They called her the Virgin Widow. At first, it sounded like gossip, but the truth behind that name was real, and the decision she made one hot afternoon would soon become the most talked about moment in the history of that small mountain town. In the year 1872, the town of Paintsville, Kentucky, was still trying to understand what freedom really meant. The war had ended years earlier. Yet the pain it left behind still lived in the fields, the hollows, and the memories of the people. The towering hills were covered in thick forests of oak and hickory, and the winding Lavisa Fork of the big sandy river carried flatboats loaded with timber, coal, and restless dreams. It was in this uncertain world that Mabel lived alone in a large, aging farmhouse at the edge of town. She had become a widow at the young age of 21 after her husband died suddenly from a terrible fever during the humid summer of 1869. But what made the town truly curious about her life was something few people expected. Her marriage had never truly begun. Her husband had been sick even before their wedding, and he died only months later. Their marriage had never been completed, so folks began calling her the Virgin Widow. Some said it with pity, others with a sneer. Mabel herself never spoke about it. She walked through town with quiet dignity, wearing simple, pale dresses, her dark hair tied neatly behind her head. Yet behind her calm expression were eyes that seemed to study everything carefully, as if she understood more about the world than most people around her. Life after the war was confusing for everyone in Paintsville, especially for the many formerly enslaved men and women who were trying to build new lives. Some stayed near the old farms and worked for small wages. Others traveled north, searching for a better future. But even though slavery had officially ended, many cruel ideas still survived in secret. Among the darkest was the practice of forcing strong men to father children, simply to grow the labor force. These men were cruelly called breeders by those who treated human life like livestock. Most people never spoke about it openly, but the rumors moved quietly through the mountains like wood smoke. One afternoon during the spring of 1872, Mabel drove her small buggy into town and stopped near a dusty trading yard where labor contracts were sometimes arranged. The sun was bright and harsh, the air heavy with the smell of horses and sawdust. A crowd had gathered around a man who claimed he was leaving Kentucky forever and needed to sell everything quickly. Among the few things he offered was a tall, silent black man named Isaiah. Isaiah stood quietly with his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the ground, as if he had learned long ago that looking too directly at strangers could bring trouble. The trader explained loudly that Isaiah had once been valued because he was strong and had fathered many children among enslaved families. Now, with debts rising and his plans to leave the state, the trader said he would sell the man for almost nothing. Just $2. Some people in the crowd laughed nervously, unsure whether to treat it as a joke or a cruel reminder of the past. Then something happened that instantly silenced the entire crowd. Mabel stepped forward from the edge of the gathering, her dress brushing the dusty ground as she walked. People immediately began whispering, because it was rare to see the young widow standing in such a rough place alone. She stopped in front of Isaiah and looked at him for a moment. Those who watched later said the moment felt strange, almost as if the two strangers were speaking without words. Then Mabel calmly reached into the small purse hanging from her wrist and removed 2 silver coins. The metal flashed briefly in the bright Kentucky sunlight before she placed them into the trader's hand. The transaction was finished in seconds. The crowd gasped in disbelief. Why would a quiet widow from a respectable family buy a man whose reputation carried such a troubling meaning? Some believed she had lost her senses. Others suspected something far more mysterious. Isaiah himself looked confused as the trader quickly handed Mabel a small paper confirming the agreement. Without explaining anything, she turned and walked toward her buggy. Then she spoke to Isaiah for the first time, her voice calm and steady as she told him to follow her home. The silence that fell over the trading yard felt heavier than a coming storm, because no one in Paintsville understood why the virgin widow had just spent $2 on a man like Isaiah. And deep inside the quiet farmhouse, waiting at the edge of town, the truth behind her decision was about to begin unfolding. A truth that would soon shock everyone who thought they understood the strange, young widow named Mabel. The road from Paintsville to Mabel's farmhouse stretched quietly between wooded hills and tall oak trees, whose branches hung low with wild grapevines. Isaiah walked several steps behind the small buggy as it moved slowly along the dusty road. The afternoon sun burned brightly above them, and the sound of wagon wheels turning over dry soil was the only noise for a long time. People working in nearby fields stopped what they were doing to stare as the strange pair passed by. Word had already begun spreading through town like wildfire. The virgin widow had bought a man for $2. No one understood why. Some people believed she planned to force him to work the fields alone. Others whispered darker rumors. But the truth was that no one truly understood the quiet woman who lived at the edge of Paintsville. Isaiah kept his eyes forward as he walked. His life had taught him that asking questions too soon could bring punishment. Still, inside his mind, many thoughts were racing. He'd been sold before, traded before, used before, but never like this. Never by someone who had barely spoken a word, and never for such a strange price. When they finally reached the farmhouse, Isaiah slowed his steps and looked up for the first time. The house stood large and silent at the end of a long path, surrounded by overgrown grass and aging fences. It had once been beautiful. That much was clear. The tall white columns still stood proudly at the front porch, though the paint was beginning to fade. The windows were wide and tall, reflecting the bright Kentucky sky like quiet mirrors. Yet something about the place felt different from the other farms Isaiah had known. There were no shouting overseers, no crowded rows of cabins filled with exhausted workers. The land seemed strangely quiet, almost peaceful. Mabel stepped down from the buggy and tied the horse calmly beside the porch. Then she turned and looked at Isaiah properly for the first time since leaving the trading yard. Her expression was serious but not cruel. She studied him the way someone might study a puzzle they were trying to understand. After a moment, she gestured toward the porch and told him he could come inside if he wished, or remain outside if that made him more comfortable. The choice surprised him. For a moment, Isaiah simply stood there, unsure whether it was some kind of test. In all his years, no one had ever offered him a choice like that. Isaiah eventually stepped onto the porch carefully, his boots making soft sounds against the wooden boards. The inside of the house was cool and dim compared to the bright afternoon outside. Mabel led him into a large sitting room, where old furniture rested quietly beneath tall windows. Dust floated slowly through beams of sunlight that slipped between the curtains. On one wall hung a large portrait of a man. Isaiah assumed he must have been her late husband. The man in the painting looked serious and pale, his eyes distant, as if he had been tired, even before the artist finished the portrait. Mabel noticed Isaiah looking at the painting and spoke softly. She explained that the man had died 3 years earlier, long before the war truly ended. She said it calmly, without sadness in her voice, as if she had already made peace with the memory. Then she turned back to Isaiah and said something that made him feel even more confused. She told him that he was not a slave here. She said the war had already ended that cruel chapter, and she had no intention of bringing it back inside her home. Isaiah listened carefully but remained cautious. He had heard promises before that later turned into chains. Mabel walked to a small wooden table and poured 2 glasses of water from a large pitcher. She handed one to Isaiah and invited him to sit if he wished. Again, the offer surprised him. For a moment, he hesitated, then slowly sat on the edge of a chair, holding the glass carefully, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. Mabel sat across from him and folded her hands calmly in her lap. The silence between them lasted several long seconds before she finally explained why she had bought him. She said that when she heard the trader describe him, she felt anger rise inside her like a sudden fire. Human beings were not animals to be bred and sold. Yet she also understood something important about the world around them. The town of Paintsville still lived with old habits and old fears. Many powerful men still believed they could control the lives of others through intimidation and violence. Mabel said she had spent years watching how these men behaved. She had seen how they threatened newly freed families, how they used fear to keep people poor and silent. She had begun to believe that someone needed to stand against them, but she could not do it alone. When she looked at Isaiah in the trading yard, she saw a man who had survived unimaginable cruelty and still stood with quiet strength. That was why she spent the $2. Isaiah listened without interrupting, though every word she spoke made his thoughts spin faster. He had expected orders, maybe hard labor or some strange demand. Instead, this young widow was speaking about dignity and freedom. It felt almost unreal. After a moment, he asked the first question he had allowed himself since leaving the trading yard. He asked her what she expected from him now. Mabel did not answer immediately. She stood and walked toward the tall window overlooking the fields. The late afternoon sun had begun to soften, turning the distant hills golden. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet determination that made Isaiah sit straighter in his chair. She said the world was changing slowly, but the men who had once owned farms still believed they owned the future as well. They were already gathering in secret groups, planning ways to control the town again through violence and fear. Mabel had overheard some of these plans through conversations that took place in the homes of wealthy neighbors. She explained that her late husband's family had once been connected to many powerful landowners in the region, which meant she still heard things others did not. What she had heard frightened her deeply, but fear had slowly turned into resolve. She turned back toward Isaiah and told him the truth she had not dared speak in town. She needed someone she could trust, someone strong enough to help protect people who were still being threatened quietly across the county. Families who had once been enslaved were trying to build homes and farms, yet groups of angry men were already planning to drive them away. Mabel believed Isaiah understood that danger better than anyone else. She said she did not buy him for labor or for profit. She bought him because it was the only way to remove him from a man who clearly saw him as nothing more than property. Isaiah felt a strange mix of emotions rising inside him. Suspicion still lingered, yet there was something sincere in her voice that was difficult to ignore. For years, he had survived by trusting no one. Yet the calm honesty in Mabel's eyes made him wonder if perhaps this moment was different from the countless others that had shaped his difficult life. Tuning evenings slowly settled over the farmhouse as the sky turned deep shades of orange and purple. Outside, crickets began their nightly songs in the tall grass. Mabel lit a small oil lamp and placed it on the table between them. The warm glow softened the shadows in the room, making the quiet space feel almost peaceful. Isaiah realized that for the first time in many years, he was sitting inside a house without fear of being shouted at or ordered to leave. Yet questions still filled his mind. Why had this young widow risked her reputation to help a stranger? Why had she chosen him out of everyone in that trading yard? And what exactly did she expect to happen next? Mabel seemed to sense his thoughts, even though he had not spoken them aloud. She explained that the town of Paintsville was standing on the edge of something dangerous. The war had ended, but the anger it created had not disappeared. Some men were preparing to rebuild their old power by force. Others were secretly helping newly freed families build schools and farms. Two different futures were slowly forming in the shadows, and very soon, those futures would collide. Isaiah stared quietly at the flickering lamp as her words settled in his mind. He had spent his entire life surviving cruelty, never imagining he might play a role in shaping anything larger than his own survival. Yet now this mysterious widow was speaking as if he could help change the direction of an entire town. The idea felt impossible, yet something inside him stirred for the first time in years. Perhaps it was hope. Perhaps it was curiosity. Or perhaps it was the quiet realization that fate sometimes begins in the most unexpected ways. $2 had carried him from the trading yard to this quiet house at the edge of Paintsville. But Isaiah was beginning to sense that the real price of that moment had not yet been revealed. Because outside the peaceful fields and darkening sky, powerful men were already hearing rumors about what the virgin widow had done that afternoon, and some of those men were not pleased at all. In fact, by the time night fully settled over the Appalachian Valley, a small group of angry landowners had already begun gathering in a nearby tavern. They were whispering about the widow, about the man she bought, and about the possibility that her strange decision might threaten the fragile order they believed still belonged to them. What they decided during that secret meeting would soon push the quiet town of Paintsville toward a confrontation no one could stop, and neither Mabel nor Isaiah yet understood how dangerous the coming days were about to become. Morning arrived slowly over Paintsville, the pale light of the Kentucky sun rising gently over hills still covered in soft mist. Isaiah woke early, long before the rest of the town began moving. Years of hard life had trained his body to rise before dawn. Whether he wanted to or not, for a few quiet seconds, he simply lay still, staring at the wooden ceiling above him, trying to remember where he was. Then the memories of the previous day returned all at once. The trading yard, the crowd staring, the 2 silver coins, and the mysterious young widow who had bought him and brought him to this silent farmhouse. Isaiah sat up slowly on the small bed in the room Mabel had given him. The room was simple but clean. A wooden chair stood beside the window, and a folded blanket rested at the foot of the bed. No chains, no locked door, no guards. The freedom of the moment felt almost unreal. Through the open window, he could hear birds singing in the distance and the soft rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. For a man who had spent most of his life under the control of others, the quiet peace of that morning felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. Isaiah stepped outside just as the sun began to rise fully over the hills. The farmland stretched wide around the house, but much of it looked untouched. Tall grass had begun reclaiming parts of the old fields, and several barns stood empty in the distance. It was clear that Mabel had not tried to rebuild the farm after her husband died. Instead, she seemed to live quietly with only what she needed. Isaiah walked slowly toward the well beside the house and drew up a bucket of cool water. As he splashed the water over his face, he noticed movement on the front porch. Mabel was standing there, already dressed in one of her simple pale dresses, watching the sunrise with calm eyes. She greeted him with a small nod, as if they had known each other for years instead of only one strange day. After a moment, she invited him to join her for breakfast inside. Isaiah hesitated for a second, still adjusting to the strange kindness of the place, then followed her into the kitchen where a small table had been set with bread, eggs, and fresh fruit. They ate quietly at first. The morning light spilled gently through the windows, and for a while, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than tense. But outside the peaceful house, the town of Paintsville was already buzzing with rumors. In the dusty streets near the general store, groups of men stood talking in low voices about the event at the trading yard. Everyone had heard the story by now. The virgin widow had bought a man known as a breeder for only $2. Some people laughed at the absurdity of it. Others shook their heads in confusion. Yet there were a few men whose reactions were very different. These were the men who had once owned large farms before the war. Men who still believed the old ways should never have ended. One of them was a tall landowner named Clarence Whitmore. Whitmore had inherited thousands of acres of land from his father, and although the war had weakened his fortune, he still carried himself with the pride of someone who believed power belonged naturally to him. When he first heard the rumor about Mabel, he did not laugh like the others. Instead, his face grew cold and thoughtful. Whitmore had known Mabel's late husband years earlier, and he remembered the quiet young woman who had suddenly become a widow. At first, he assumed she would simply fade into the background of town life, but now her strange purchase had captured everyone's attention, and Whitmore did not like surprises. Later that same morning, Whitmore rode his horse down the long road toward Mabel's farm. Two other men followed behind him, both former landowners who shared his dislike for the changes spreading through the South. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust as they approached the aging farmhouse. Isaiah noticed them first while carrying a bucket of water across the yard. He stopped walking immediately, watching the three riders approach with careful eyes. Something about the way they sat tall in their saddles made his instincts alert. He had seen men like them many times before. Men who believed they had the right to control every piece of land and every person who lived on it. Mabel stepped out onto the porch as the riders reached the front gate. Her expression remained calm, though she clearly recognized the leader of the group. Clarence Whitmore removed his hat slowly and greeted her with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. He said he had come to ask about the strange story spreading through town. Was it true that she had purchased a man from the trading yard the previous day? Mabel answered simply that the story was true. Her calm honesty seemed to irritate Whitmore more than if she had denied it. He glanced briefly toward Isaiah, who stood quietly beside the well, then turned his attention back to the widow. Whitmore said that such actions could create confusion in a town already struggling with change. People might begin believing that old rules no longer applied. He spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded polite while hiding a warning beneath them. Mabel listened patiently before replying. She said that the old rules he referred to had already been broken by history itself. The war had ended slavery, whether some men liked it or not. Isaiah was a free man now. Her purchase had simply prevented a cruel trader from continuing to treat him as property. The other two riders exchanged uneasy glances at her bold words. It was rare for a woman, especially a young widow living alone, to speak so directly to men like Whitmore, but Mabel did not lower her gaze or soften her voice. Whitmore's polite smile faded slightly as the conversation continued. He told Mabel that Paintsville needed stability during these uncertain times. Actions that stirred curiosity could also stir trouble. His eyes briefly shifted toward Isaiah again, studying the tall man carefully. Then, he said something that carried a heavier meaning than the words themselves. He advised Mabel to remember that powerful friendships still existed among the landowners of the county. If she made decisions that threatened the balance of the town, she might find those friendships turning cold. For a moment, the air around the porch felt tense and heavy. Isaiah sensed the hidden threat immediately, but Mabel remained completely calm. She thanked Whitmore for his concern and said she appreciated his visit. Her tone was polite, yet firm, making it clear that the conversation was finished. After a few seconds, Whitmore placed his hat back on his head and turned his horse slowly toward the road. Without another word, the three riders left the farm, their horses disappearing into the rising heat of the late morning sun. Isaiah watched them go until the dust settled back onto the quiet road. When he turned back toward the house, he saw that Mabel was still standing on the porch, her expression thoughtful, but not frightened. For the first time since arriving at the farm, he realized how brave this quiet widow truly was. She had just faced three powerful men without showing even a moment of fear. Isaiah walked up the steps slowly and asked if she believed Whitmore would cause trouble. Mabel answered honestly that trouble had already begun. Men like Whitmore did not like losing control, even when the world around them had changed. But she also said something that surprised Isaiah once again. She told him that fear only grew stronger when good people remained silent. Someone had to stand firm, even if the cost became dangerous. As the day moved forward, the peaceful farm began to feel different. The quiet air now carried the sense that invisible eyes might be watching from the distant roads and fields. Isaiah spent the afternoon repairing a broken fence near the edge of the property, while Mabel worked inside the house, organizing old papers and letters that had belonged to her late husband. Though they worked separately, both of them were thinking about the same thing. The visit from Whitmore had been more than a simple conversation. It had been a warning. And warnings from powerful men rarely ended quietly. As evening approached, the sky turned deep shades of red and gold over the Kentucky hills. Isaiah leaned against the fence he had just repaired and looked toward the distant road, where the riders had disappeared earlier that morning. Something inside him told him that this strange new life at the farm would not remain peaceful for long. Far away in the center of Paintsville, inside a dimly lit tavern near the river, Clarence Whitmore sat at a wooden table with several other landowners. Their voices were low, but serious as they discussed the widow and the man she had brought into her home. Some of them believed the situation would fade away on its own, but Whitmore was not so certain. He had seen the determination in Mabel's eyes, and he had noticed the quiet strength of the man standing beside the well. Something about the situation disturbed him deeply. The South was already changing faster than many men could accept. If people like Mabel began encouraging newly freed men to stand confidently beside them, the fragile control that old families still held over the region might begin to collapse. Whitmore leaned forward in his chair and spoke a sentence that caused the others at the table to fall silent. He said that the situation needed to be handled before it inspired the wrong kind of courage among the wrong kind of people. Back at the farm, neither Mabel nor Isaiah yet knew about the conversation taking place in that dark tavern. But as night slowly covered the land, and the distant sounds of the town faded into silence, the quiet house at the edge of Paintsville stood unknowingly at the center of a growing storm. A storm that had begun with 2 silver coins, and that would soon test the courage of everyone involved. And by the time the next sunrise arrived over the Kentucky hills, the virgin widow and the man she bought for $2 would find themselves facing dangers neither of them had fully imagined. The night after Clarence Whitmore's visit settled heavily over the farm like a thick blanket of silence. The moon hung low above the Appalachian hills, casting pale light across the quiet land. Inside the old house, Mabel sat at a wooden desk near the window, reading through a bundle of old letters tied together with faded ribbon. They were letters her late husband had written years earlier, letters filled with business dealings, land agreements, and conversations with other powerful men in the county. Isaiah noticed that she had been studying those papers for hours. Occasionally, she would pause, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if something written on the page had confirmed a suspicion she already carried. Isaiah sat across the room sharpening a small farming knife against a stone, more out of habit than necessity. The gentle scraping sound echoed softly through the quiet house. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Yet, the silence between them felt thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. Outside, the crickets sang steadily in the tall grass, and somewhere far away, a dog barked once before the sound faded again into the darkness. Finally, Mabel placed the letters carefully back onto the desk and leaned back in her chair. She told Isaiah something she had not mentioned before. Her husband, though quiet and often ill, had been more observant than most people realized. During the last months of his life, he had begun keeping records of certain meetings among wealthy landowners. These meetings were not simply about crops or business. They were gatherings where some men spoke openly about rebuilding the old order that the war had destroyed. Isaiah listened closely as she explained that her husband had feared the future of the South if such ideas continued to grow. But before he could do anything with the information he had gathered, the fever took his life. The papers left behind had remained untouched for years, until recently, when Mabel began reading them out of curiosity. What she discovered inside those letters had slowly convinced her that the danger her husband once feared was already returning to Paintsville. Isaiah asked quietly what exactly the letters revealed. Mabel walked to the window and looked out across the moonlit fields before answering. She said several powerful men in the county had begun forming secret groups after the war ended. Their purpose was simple but terrifying. They wanted to intimidate newly freed families so badly that many would leave the region entirely. If those families disappeared, the landowners could quietly rebuild the system of forced labor through fear and debt. Some farmers would be trapped in unfair sharecropping contracts. Others threatened into leaving their land behind. The letters even described secret patrols meant to frighten people during the night. Isaiah felt a slow anger rising in his chest as he listened. The war had promised freedom, yet it seemed some men were already planning ways to steal it back, piece by piece. Mabel turned back toward him and said she believed Clarence Whitmore was one of the leaders behind these secret gatherings. 2. The following morning dawned warm and bright, yet the sense of danger remained quietly in the air. Isaiah spent the early hours repairing an old barn near the edge of the property, while Mabel walked through the fields examining the neglected rows of corn. She had begun thinking about planting crops again, though not in the same way her husband's family once had. Instead of building a large farm with workers under strict control, she imagined something different. Small plots of land where free families could grow crops and share the harvest fairly. It was an idea that might bring life back to the empty fields surrounding the house. But it was also an idea that men like Whitmore would likely hate. Around midday, a thin cloud of dust appeared on the distant road leading toward the farm. Isaiah noticed it immediately and stood still, watching carefully. Soon, a small wagon emerged from the dust, slowly approaching the property gate. The wagon carried an older black man and a young boy who could not have been older than 10. When they reached the edge of the property, the man climbed down carefully and removed his worn hat as a sign of respect. Isaiah walked toward them cautiously, while Mabel stepped down from the porch to greet the visitors. The older man introduced himself as Samuel Turner. He explained that he had once worked on a farm several miles away before the war ended. Now, he was trying to build a small farm for his family on a patch of land near the river. But during the previous night, a group of masked riders had visited his home. They burned part of his fence and warned him to leave the county before the next full moon. The young boy standing beside him was his grandson, and the fear in the child's eyes made the story feel painfully real. Samuel said he had heard rumors that the widow at the old farmhouse was not afraid to stand against powerful men, so he had come hoping she might offer advice or help. Mabel listened quietly without interrupting. When Samuel finished speaking, she asked only one question. She asked if he planned to leave the land he was trying to farm. Samuel shook his head firmly and said he had spent too many years dreaming of freedom to abandon it now. Mabel nodded slowly, then invited Samuel and his grandson to sit on the porch while she brought them food and water. Isaiah watched the scene carefully, feeling the weight of what was happening. Just one day earlier, he had been a stranger purchased for $2. Now, he was standing beside a widow who seemed determined to challenge powerful men in order to protect families like Samuel's. As the afternoon passed, Samuel explained more details about the masked riders who had threatened him. Though their faces were hidden, he recognized the voice of one man clearly. It belonged to a farm overseer who worked for Clarence Whitmore. When Samuel finally prepared to leave, Mabel walked with him to his wagon. She told him he should continue building his farm and not allow fear to drive him away. She also promised something that made Isaiah glance toward her with surprise. She said if the riders returned again, they would not find Samuel alone. Samuel thanked her deeply before climbing back onto the wagon seat beside his grandson. As the wagon rolled slowly away down the dusty road, Isaiah turned to Mabel and asked what she meant by that promise. Mabel answered calmly that she had already been thinking about the same problem long before Samuel arrived. If families were being threatened across the county, someone needed to organize protection before the intimidation grew stronger. Isaiah felt the seriousness of her words settle in his mind like a heavy stone. Later that evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset spread across the wide Kentucky sky. Mabel explained that many newly freed families were scattered across the countryside, each struggling alone against the pressure from powerful landowners. But if those families began supporting one another, they might build something stronger than fear. Isaiah asked how they could possibly bring people together when so many were already frightened. Mabel smiled slightly and pointed across the fields surrounding the house. She said the land here had once been used to control people. Now, it could become a place where people gathered freely to plan their future. She wanted the farm to become a meeting place where farmers could share knowledge, protect one another, and create opportunities that did not depend on the approval of men like Whitmore. Isaiah felt both hope and concern at the same time. The idea sounded noble, but it would certainly attract attention from the very men who wished to stop such cooperation. Mabel seemed to understand his thoughts without needing it to hear them spoken aloud. She admitted that the plan carried real danger, yet she believed the greater danger was allowing fear to silence everyone who wanted a better life. For years, she had watched the world change slowly from behind the quiet walls of the farmhouse. Now she believed the moment had come to step forward rather than remain a silent observer. Isaiah leaned back against the wooden porch rail, staring across the darkening fields. The sky was now glowing deep orange and purple, the last light of the sun disappearing beyond the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed faintly across the valley. What neither of them knew was that several miles away, near the river road, a group of riders had already gathered again beneath the cover of night. Their horses shifted impatiently, while the men spoke quietly among themselves. Clarence Whitmore stood among them, his face hard and determined as he listened to reports about Samuel Turner visiting the widow's farm earlier that day. The news confirmed his growing suspicion that Mabel intended to interfere with the plans he and others had carefully set in motion. Whitmore looked toward the distant direction of the farmhouse and made a decision that would soon place everyone there in serious danger. He told the riders that sometimes problems had to be solved quickly before they grew into movements that could not be controlled. Back at the quiet farm, Isaiah and Mabel remained unaware of the approaching storm. The night air had grown cooler, and the stars above the Kentucky hills shone brightly across the dark sky. Yet somewhere beyond those peaceful fields, a group of men was already preparing to ride again before the night ended. And when those riders reached the lonely house at the edge of Paintsville, the virgin widow and the man she bought for $2 would face the first true test of their courage. The night grew deeper over the Kentucky hills, and the farmhouse stood quietly beneath the sky filled with bright stars. The air had cooled after the long warm day, and a gentle breeze moved softly through the tall grass surrounding the property. Isaiah had remained awake longer than usual that night. Something inside him felt unsettled, a quiet instinct shaped by years of surviving danger. He sat on the porch steps, listening carefully to the sounds of the countryside. Most nights in Paintsville were peaceful, filled only with crickets, distant owls, and the rustling of leaves. But tonight his ears were searching for something else, something out of place. Inside the house, Mabel had just finished extinguishing the oil lamps before preparing for sleep. She stepped onto the porch to find Isaiah, still sitting there in the dim moonlight. When she asked why he had not gone to bed yet, Isaiah answered honestly. He said he could not explain it fully, but the night felt wrong somehow. Mabel listened quietly before sitting down beside him on the wooden step. For several moments, they simply watched the wide fields stretching into darkness beyond the house. Far down the narrow road leading toward the farm, a group of horses moved slowly through the shadows of the trees. Their riders spoke very little as they guided the animals carefully along the quiet path. There were 6 men in total, their faces hidden beneath dark cloth coverings. The only clear sound was the soft rhythm of hooves touching the dirt road. At the front of the group rode Clarence Whitmore. His tall figure sat confidently in the saddle, as if he had made similar journeys many times before. One of the men beside him asked quietly whether they were certain about this plan. Whitmore replied that the situation had already gone too far. If the widow continued encouraging free families to gather at her farm, it would send a dangerous message throughout the county. Fear, he believed, was the only language that still kept people obedient. Tonight they would remind everyone in Paintsville who truly controlled the land. Back at the house, Isaiah suddenly raised his head slightly. At first, the sound was faint, almost hidden beneath the noise of insects in the grass. But within seconds, the distant rhythm became clearer. Hooves, several of them, moving slowly along the road toward the property. Isaiah stood immediately, his body tense as he stared into the darkness beyond the gate. Mabel rose beside him, her expression serious but calm. Neither of them spoke at first. They simply listened as the sound grew closer with each passing moment. The riders soon appeared as dark shapes against the pale road, illuminated by moonlight. When the horses reached the gate, they stopped, their riders sitting silently in the saddle for several seconds. The scene felt heavy with tension. Finally, one of the men urged his horse forward, until it stood just outside the entrance to the property. Whitmore's voice came from beneath the cloth covering his face. Though Isaiah recognized the tone immediately from the earlier visit that morning. Whitmore announced that they had come with a simple warning. The widow's recent activities were creating unrest in the county, harboring men like Isaiah and encouraging families like Samuel Turner's to resist advice from landowners would lead to consequences. Mabel stepped forward onto the path, standing straight despite the 6 mounted riders towering above her. Her voice remained steady as she replied that no man needed permission to live freely on land he worked himself. The riders shifted uneasily at her bold response. Few people ever spoke so directly to men who hid behind masks and horses in the middle of the night. Whitmore's patience quickly began to thin. He told her that stubborn pride often led people into trouble they could not escape. Then he gestured toward one of the riders behind him. The man pulled a small torch from his saddle and struck a match against the metal stirrup. Within seconds, a bright flame flickered in the night air, casting long dancing shadows across the road and fields. Isaiah felt his muscles tighten as the rider lowered the torch toward the dry grass near the fence line. The message was clear. Fire was one of the simplest ways to destroy a place like this. A few burning fences could easily grow into a blaze large enough to consume the barns and perhaps even the house. Before the torch could touch the ground, Isaiah stepped forward into the torchlight. His tall figure stood firmly between the riders and the fence. The sudden movement caught the attention of every man on horseback. Isaiah did not shout or threaten. Instead, he spoke in a low, calm voice that carried clearly through the still night. He said that burning land belonging to a widow would not prove strength. It would only reveal cowardice. The riders glanced at one another uneasily. They had expected fear or pleading, not quiet defiance. Whitmore stared down at Isaiah for several seconds, studying the man carefully. Then he laughed softly beneath his mask and said Isaiah seemed to have forgotten his place in the world. Isaiah answered without raising his voice. He said the war had already changed everyone's place in the world, whether certain men accepted that truth or not. The torchlight flickered across his face as he spoke, revealing eyes that carried no fear. Whitmore realized something uncomfortable in that moment. The tall man standing before him was not behaving like someone who had spent his life under control. Instead, Isaiah stood with the calm confidence of someone who had already survived worse threats than this. The riders hesitated, uncertain how far they should push the situation. One of them whispered that they should simply frighten the widow and leave. But Whitmore remained silent, clearly wrestling with his pride. Mabel stepped forward again before the tension could explode further. She spoke clearly so every rider could hear her words. She said if they wished to threaten her home, they should at least show their faces while doing it. Men who believed their actions were honorable did not need masks in the darkness. The statement struck the group harder than any shouted insult. One rider actually shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Whitmore's eyes narrowed beneath the cloth covering his face. For a long moment, he seemed ready to give the order that would turn the threat into violence. Yet, something held him back. Perhaps it was the fearless calm of the widow. Perhaps it was the silent strength of the man standing beside her. Or perhaps it was the quiet realization that causing open destruction could bring unwanted attention from authorities in the region. Whitmore finally raised his hand slightly, signaling the rider with the torch to pull it back. The flame continued to burn brightly as the man lifted it away from the dry grass. Whitmore then spoke one final warning. He told Mabel that courage could sometimes inspire others, but it could also place targets on people who were not prepared for the consequences. If she continued interfering with the order of the county, the next visit might not end so quietly. With that, he turned his horse sharply and began riding back down the dark road. The other riders followed behind him one by one, their torches and silhouettes slowly disappearing into the distance. For several minutes after the riders left, Isaiah and Mabel remained standing near the gate, watching the empty road. The quiet night slowly returned as the sound of hooves faded completely. Isaiah finally released a slow breath he had been holding since the confrontation began. Mabel turned toward the fields and studied the dark horizon thoughtfully. She knew the encounter had only confirmed what she already believed. Men like Whitmore would not stop simply because their first threat failed. If anything, they would begin planning something more serious. Isaiah asked her if she regretted making herself a target for such dangerous people. Mabel answered honestly that fear had already ruled too many lives in the South. If no one challenged it, the future would belong entirely to men like Whitmore. The two of them walked slowly back toward the porch, beneath the soft moonlight. Isaiah looked across the silent land surrounding the farm and realized how much could be lost if violence ever truly came to this place. Yet, he also understood something else. The courage shown by the quiet widow that night had awakened a powerful idea inside him. Perhaps the farm could indeed become something different from the places he had known all his life. Perhaps it could become a place where fear no longer decided who deserved dignity. Neither of them realized that several miles away, Whitmore and his riders had stopped again along the river road. The men spoke angrily among themselves about the humiliation of being challenged by a widow and a former slave. Whitmore listened quietly before making a final decision. He told them that simple warnings would no longer solve the problem. The widow's defiance had already gone too far. If they wanted to stop her influence from spreading through the county, they would need to strike in a way that could not be ignored. Back at the farm, the oil lamps inside the house were lit once again as Isaiah and Mabel prepared for a long discussion about what had just happened. The night that began with quiet suspicion had now confirmed their fears. A storm was forming around Paintsville, and its center was the lonely farm where a virgin widow and a man bought for $2 had chosen to stand without fear. And as the dark hours of the night slowly passed, Neither of them yet understood just how powerful the coming storm would soon become. The morning after the masked riders left the farm did not feel peaceful, even though the sky above Paintsville was bright and clear. The sun rose slowly over the hills, spreading warm light across the tall grass and the quiet barns that stood near the edge of the property. Isaiah had not slept much during the night. The sound of those horses and the sight of that burning torch had remained in his mind. Long after the riders disappeared into the darkness, he woke before the sun fully climbed above the horizon and walked out toward the gate where the confrontation had taken place. The ground still showed the deep marks of horseshoes pressed into the dirt road. Isaiah studied those marks carefully, then looked across the empty land beyond them. The message from Whitmore had been clear. This was only the beginning. Inside the house, Mabel was already awake as well. She stood near the window watching Isaiah examine the road. Her expression was thoughtful, yet there was no fear in her eyes. Instead, there was something stronger. A quiet determination that seemed even firmer than the day before. When Isaiah returned to the porch, Mabel had already placed 2 cups of coffee on the small wooden table beside the steps. They sat together in silence for several minutes before either of them spoke. Finally, Isaiah asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the riders left. He asked whether the farm could truly survive the kind of pressure Whitmore and his friends were prepared to bring. Mabel took a slow sip from her cup before answering. She admitted the danger was real, but she also believed something important had already begun happening across the county. More and more families were refusing to bow their heads the way they once had. Some were starting farms. Others were building schools and churches. If people like Whitmore succeeded in frightening them away, the future of freedom in that region would disappear quietly. Mabel said the farm could not simply be a safe place for her alone. It had to become something stronger, something that offered protection and unity for others who were facing the same threats. Later that morning, Isaiah rode into Paintsville with a small wagon to collect supplies from the general store. As he entered the town, he immediately noticed the way people were watching him. The story of the night visit had already spread faster than he expected. Several men standing outside the store stopped talking when he walked past them. Others simply stared in silence. Isaiah had experienced such attention before in different forms throughout his life. Yet, this time, the feeling was slightly different. There was curiosity mixed with something else. Perhaps it was respect. Or perhaps it was concern for the trouble that might soon follow. Inside the general store, the owner greeted Isaiah politely, but spoke in a quiet voice. He asked whether the rumors about masked riders at the farm were true. Isaiah answered honestly that they were. The store owner shook his head slowly and said many people in town had feared something like that would happen eventually. Men like Whitmore did not like being challenged. While Isaiah finished gathering supplies, 2 other men quietly approached him near the back of the store. One of them introduced himself as Thomas Green, a farmer who owned a small piece of land several miles north of Paintsville. The other man was called Joseph Carter, a carpenter who helped build homes and barns throughout the county. Both men spoke cautiously at first, glancing toward the front door, as if they did not want certain ears to hear the conversation. Thomas explained that several families had already heard about the widow's promise to help people like Samuel Turner stand their ground. He said many farmers were tired of living in fear of night riders and hidden threats. Joseph added that if the farm truly intended to become a place where people could organize protection, they might find more support than they expected. Isaiah listened carefully, surprised by the sudden appearance of allies he had never met before. When Isaiah returned to the farm later that afternoon, he shared everything he had heard in town. Mabel listened closely as he described the quiet support from men like Thomas Green and Joseph Carter. The news seemed to confirm something she had hoped for, but could never be certain about. The courage shown during the night confrontation had begun spreading through the county as a story of resistance. People who once believed they were alone were starting to realize others felt the same fear and anger. Mabel suggested inviting several of these families to the farm for a meeting within the next few days. If they were going to stand together against intimidation, they would need to organize carefully. Isaiah agreed, though he reminded her that such a gathering would also attract attention from Whitmore and his followers. Mabel nodded calmly. She knew the risk could not be avoided anymore. That evening, Isaiah rode out again to visit Samuel Turner and deliver the message personally. Samuel's small farm stood near the river, surrounded by a rough wooden fence that showed signs of the recent attack. When Isaiah arrived, he found Samuel repairing the damaged sections with the help of his grandson. The boy's face lit up with relief when he recognized the tall man from the farm. Isaiah explained that Mabel planned to hold a meeting where families could discuss how to protect one another and share resources. Samuel listened with great interest. After years of believing his family would have to survive alone, the idea of cooperation sounded almost unbelievable. He promised to attend and said he would bring 2 neighboring farmers who had also received threats during recent weeks. While Isaiah rode back toward the farm under the soft glow of the evening sky, another meeting was taking place in the dim back room of the same tavern where Whitmore and his allies had gathered before. The mood inside the room was far more tense than it had been the previous night. Several landowners were angry about how the confrontation at the farm had ended without any real result. They believed Whitmore should have acted more forcefully while he had the chance. Whitmore listened to their complaints in silence before finally raising his hand for quiet. His voice remained calm, but carried a cold certainty that silenced the entire table. He explained that fear worked best when it spread slowly through many examples. Burning one fence might frighten a single farmer, but destroying something larger could send a message across the entire county. One of the men asked what kind of example he had in mind. Whitmore leaned forward slightly and tapped his finger against the wooden table as he answered. He said the widow's farm itself had become the center of this growing defiance. If that place suddenly suffered a disaster, the people gathering around it might lose their courage very quickly. Several men exchanged uneasy glances as they understood what he was suggesting. Destroying an entire farmhouse would not simply be a warning. It would be an act that could attract attention far beyond Paintsville. Whitmore noticed their hesitation and reminded them that maintaining control sometimes required bold action. If the widow's influence continued to spread, the region could soon become impossible to manage. Back at the farm, Isaiah and Mabel were standing near the barn, watching the last light of the sun disappear behind the distant trees. Isaiah had just returned from Samuel's farm and shared the good news about several families willing to attend the meeting. Mabel smiled slightly as she listened, though her eyes remained thoughtful. She understood that each new ally also increased the risk of retaliation from Whitmore's group. Still, she believed the meeting had to happen. People needed to see one another face to face if they were going to trust each other enough to stand together. As darkness slowly covered the land again, the farm seemed calm and quiet. The house glowed warmly with lamplight, and the soft sounds of the countryside returned with the night air. Yet beyond the peaceful fields, plans were already forming that could soon threaten everything Mabel hoped to build. Whitmore and his allies had begun preparing an act that would shock the entire county if it succeeded. Inside the house, Isaiah placed several lanterns near the windows and checked the doors carefully before sitting down at the kitchen table. Mabel joined him with a stack of paper, where she had begun writing invitations for the coming meeting. The quiet determination in the room felt strong, almost inspiring. Yet both of them understood the truth that hung quietly over the farm that night. Courage had begun to gather around their cause, but so had danger. And somewhere in the darkness beyond Paintsville, men with power and pride were already preparing a move that could either destroy their efforts completely or ignite a fight that would change the future of the entire county. The day of the meeting arrived beneath a wide, blue Kentucky sky, warm and bright, as if the land itself had no knowledge of the tensions growing beneath its calm surface. From early morning, Isaiah could see wagons moving slowly along the distant roads that led toward the farm. Some carried entire families, sitting quietly on wooden benches. Others brought single farmers riding on horseback. By midday, the once silent yard around Mabel's house looked very different from the lonely place it had been just days earlier. Nearly 30 people had gathered beneath the large oak tree beside the barn. Some were men who worked small farms. Others were women who had traveled miles with their children, just to hear what the virgin widow had to say. Many of them had heard rumors about the night riders. Many had lived through threats themselves. Yet today they had come because they believed something important might begin here. Isaiah stood near the edge of the gathering, watching carefully as more wagons arrived. The faces he saw carried a mixture of hope and caution. These were people who had learned through painful experience that promises could easily turn into disappointment. Still, the simple fact that they had come together already meant something powerful. Mabel stepped forward and greeted each family warmly as they arrived. She did not stand above them like an owner welcoming workers. Instead, she spoke to them as neighbors. When everyone had settled beneath the shade of the oak tree, she began explaining the reason she had invited them. She spoke about the fear spreading across the county. She spoke about the masked riders and the quiet threats that had already begun forcing some families to abandon their land. But she also spoke about something else. She spoke about unity. She said that fear could control people only when they believed they were alone. For nearly an hour, the gathering continued as different farmers stood up to share their own stories. One man described how his barn had been burned after he refused to sell his land to a wealthy landowner. Another woman explained how riders had circled her home at night to frighten her children. Each story added another layer to the truth everyone already sensed. The threats were not random acts of cruelty. They were part of a pattern meant to push certain families away so others could quietly take control again. Isaiah listened closely to each voice, realizing how deeply the problem had spread across the county. Yet he also noticed something important happening among the crowd. The more people spoke, the stronger their confidence seemed to grow. When fear was shared openly, it began losing some of its power. As the sun moved slowly toward the afternoon sky, Mabel outlined her idea for the farm. She explained that the land surrounding the house would no longer remain unused. Instead, families could gather there to exchange crops, tools, and knowledge. The barn could store shared supplies. The house could serve as a meeting place whenever decisions needed to be made. Most importantly, the people present would form a network of support. If one family faced threats or intimidation, others would come quickly to help protect them. No farm, no home, and no child should have to face night riders alone again. A quiet murmur of agreement moved through the crowd as people looked at one another. What had begun as a simple meeting was slowly becoming something much larger. But while hope was rising beneath the oak tree, danger was also moving closer along the road beyond the fields. Several miles away, Clarence Whitmore and a group of riders had already begun their journey toward the farm. This time, they were not coming simply to warn or intimidate. Hidden among their saddlebags were bottles filled with kerosene and bundles of cloth meant to start fires quickly. Whitmore had decided that the farm itself had to disappear if he wanted to crush the growing courage spreading through Paintsville. As the riders moved through the trees, the afternoon sunlight glinted against the metal of their stirrups and the determined anger in their eyes. Back at the farm, the meeting was reaching its most important moment. Isaiah stood beside Mabel as she asked the gathered families a final question. She asked whether they were willing to stand together if trouble came, not just today, but in the months and years ahead. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Samuel Turner slowly stepped forward from the crowd. The older farmer removed his hat and looked around at the faces of his neighbors. He said he had spent most of his life being told where he could live and what he could do. But he had promised his grandson that the next generation would grow up in a different world. If standing together with others could help build that future, then he would not run away again. One by one, other voices joined him. Some spoke with quiet determination. Others spoke with strong emotion. Yet the message was the same. They were ready to stand together. At that exact moment, Isaiah heard something that made him turn his head sharply toward the distant road. The faint, but unmistakable sound of approaching horses. He stepped forward quickly, his eyes scanning the edge of the fields. Within seconds, the riders appeared, moving fast across the open land toward the farm gate. Gasps spread through the gathering as people recognized the masked figures approaching, with torches already lit in their hands. Whitmore and his men had not expected to find dozens of witnesses waiting for them. They had planned to strike quickly and leave before anyone could respond. Instead, they now faced an entire community standing together in the open yard. The riders slowed their horses uncertainly as they reached the entrance to the property. Whitmore stared at the unexpected crowd beneath the oak tree. Families, farmers, and children stood side by side, watching them. No one ran. No one hid. Isaiah stepped forward until he stood directly in front of the gate again, just as he had during the first confrontation. But this time, he was not alone. Samuel Turner stood beside him. Then Thomas Green joined them. Then Joseph Carter. Soon, nearly every man in the gathering had stepped forward to form a quiet line between the riders and the house. For a long, tense moment, the entire scene remained frozen in silence. Whitmore's men shifted uneasily in their saddles, realizing their torches and threats suddenly looked very different when facing an entire community instead of two isolated people. Mabel walked forward calmly and stood beside Isaiah. Her voice carried clearly across the open yard as she addressed the riders. She said they had come to frighten a widow and one man. Instead, they had found a county that was tired of living in fear. Whitmore looked around at the determined faces staring back at him. He understood the situation had changed completely. If he attacked now, the story would spread far beyond Paintsville. It would become a scandal that even powerful friends might struggle to defend. Slowly, he raised his hand, signaling his riders to lower their torches. One by one, the flames were extinguished against the dirt road. Without speaking another word, Whitmore turned his horse and rode away. The others followed behind him, disappearing into the distance, just as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. The yard remained silent for several seconds after the riders left. Then a wave of relief and quiet pride spread through the crowd. For the first time, many of those families realized something powerful. Fear had ruled them for years, but unity had just driven it away without a single shot being fired. Mabel looked across the faces gathered beneath the oak tree and understood that the farm had already become what she hoped it could be. Not a place of ownership, but a place of courage. As evening settled over Paintsville, wagons slowly began leaving the farm, carrying families back to their farms with renewed determination. Isaiah remained standing beside Mabel near the gate, watching the last wagon disappear down the road. The same road where riders once came with threats, now carried people returning home with hope. And that is how the story of the Virgin Widow and the man she bought for $2 became one of the most powerful legends in that Kentucky valley. Not because of wealth or power, but because courage inspired others to stand together when it mattered most. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your city and your country. Stories like this remind us that courage can come from the most unexpected places. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who believes history still has lessons for the future. More powerful stories are waiting for you in our next video.